This episode is brought to you by Ursa Minor Outfitters. Folks, I'm absolutely in love with my loon mug. It's handmade, it's an absolute piece of art. Whether it's at the office or at the house, people keep asking to check it out. If you're not a loon fan, they also have other beautiful mugs for wildlife fans of moose, bears, and eagles. They specialize in products highlighting the outdoors and local pride through quality design by local artists. They've even started expanding into items beyond mugs, like apparel, dog accessories, and soon candles and more. They also try to partner and highlight other small businesses, and in some cases, forego profits in lieu of charitable giving to help their community, such as the dog rescue. So check them out, UrsaMinorOutfitters.com, and enter promo code HikesMikes10 at checkout to receive 10% off your order. And for our four-legged hiking partners, they also have a portable silicone dog bowl and also a sweet over-the-collar dog bandana. Go check them out, UrsaMinorOutfitters.com, and don't forget to enter promo code HikesMikes10 at checkout to receive 10% off your order. Welcome, everyone, to the latest episode of the Hikes and Mikes podcast. I'm your host, Ivan, and I'm excited to share this new season of the podcast with you. With both fall and winter arriving in the Pacific Northwest, it's time to store the mobile recording studio. This season, we'll be switching things up and interviewing some of my favorite hikers that I follow on Instagram virtually. We're following a similar format to season 1, where the first part of the episode focuses on the guest and their hiking adventures, and we're still going to end each episode with a speed round of this or that questions, all related to hiking. Today's episode is slightly different. Originally, I had planned to take a short week-long break after the holidays prior to restarting recording with new guests. But after some thought, I posted a story on Instagram asking for some questions from the community, and you all came through and made this episode possible. On this episode, you'll learn about why and how I started this podcast, as well as what's the scariest hike I've been on, what I have planned for my 2023 hiking adventures. Without further ado, let's jump into this episode with your host, Ivan. Welcome, everyone, to the latest episode of the Hikes and Mikes podcast. This one's going to be a little bit different, as I'm your host and your guest. I'll be sharing a little bit about my hiking history and some of my adventures, as well as answering some of the questions that you folks have submitted online via Instagram. I guess just like any other episode, we'll start with the first question that Allie Rambles suggested is, how long have I been hiking for and how did I get started? And I think I shared this on a previous episode, but my first ever hike was either right before my senior year of high school or right after, and it was terrible. I just redid the hike not too long ago, I think in November or October. It was just a brutal hike in the middle of summer. And, it was very short in the sense that it was only 2.5, 3 miles, but it was nearly 3,000 feet of elevation gain. And it had multiple false summits, which I wasn't prepared for. And each one was just demoralizing because you think you reached the top and nope. So that was my first experience and it was just bad. And that really kind of put me off from hiking. And it wasn't until maybe 2009, 2010 when I wanted to do something outside of sports. And it just so happened that our local newspaper had a weekly article that had some springtime hikes that they recommend to kind of catch the spring flowers. And one of the hikes was just 30 minutes away from where I was living at the time. So I decided to go for it that weekend. And it was in the middle of the Yakima Canyon. And the trail actually starts on a suspension bridge and it leads into an old homestead that even had a few remaining crabapple trees from the homestead era when people were living there. And as soon as I crossed the bridge and I crossed some railroad tracks, there was a table with a ranger and a few little, not baskets, but I guess you could say reptile containers. And in each one, there was 3 or 4 different snakes. And apparently those were all the snakes that were known to inhabit that area. So it was kind of cool to see gardener snakes, but then to see rattlesnakes. And I forgot what the other snake was, but that was my first introduction. And the hike itself wasn't extremely long. It was maybe 2.5 miles in, maybe 3. And then it was an out and back, but you walked along a creek that fed into the river and it kind of narrowed in. You kind of of got sandwiched in between two ridges, and there was some old structures from way back when. Towards the end, it started getting really overgrown. It got to the point where I just didn't feel comfortable continuing going, even though, you could see the trail. But I think with all the spring showers, all the vegetation had just exploded and grown and needed to be kind of scaled back before you can continue going. So I turned around, had a great time. One of my old roommates from college, he just so happened to be working at the Forest Service at that time. And I told him about the hike that I did. And since he worked at the Forest Service, I figured, he would have some good recommendations. And boy, did he. He took me on a hike that had the biggest impact in my life. And that was one of the questions what was a hike or an adventure that had the biggest impact on your life? And for me, it was Union Creek Falls. It was my first waterfall hike. I've posted it on social media, on Instagram, videos and pictures. And it's just a beautiful, 45 foot waterfall. The trail itself isn't that long. I think total out and back, even if you make it to the top of the falls, you're probably looking no more than 2.5 miles. But one of the cool things is when I first went to it with my buddy, there was a footbridge that got washed out during a flood a few years back, and somebody had put a log to cross the creek. That was one way. That was the fun way. Or you could go around, and there was a set of cabins that you could walk through. I don't know if the owners of the cabins like that as much, but we typically stuck to the log bridge if it was safe to cross. And it just so happened a year or two later, his sister put paracord across the log, so you kind of had at least a rail in a sense to cross it. And one of his projects, I think a year or two after that, was to actually make it a real bridge to cross. So they shaved down the log, they added real rails to it, and now it's become a little bit more accessible. But the trail itself leads you to 3 different viewpoints, and each viewpoint is, closer and closer to the waterfall. But the first viewpoint, it shows where the original waterfall stood. So over, probably thousands of years or hundreds of years, it's eroded back quite a ways. And the first viewpoint is it's gorgeous, because you see the waterfall. You don't see the base of it, but you just see how awesome it is. And that's just the first viewpoint. That's the furthest one away from the falls. So then you climb back out, climb a little bit further up, and then you go down to the actual base of the waterfall. During the summertime when the water flow isn't as high, you can actually stand underneath the waterfall. It's just spectacular. It's amazing. And then if you want to get to the top of it, you climb back out, and then you climb up a ways up. You can actually get to the very top of the falls. And it's not a big creek that feeds the falls, but it just looks spectacular. I told them from the first viewpoint, because you get a little bit of a glimpse through the pine trees as you approach the first viewpoint, that all I need is the Jurassic Park theme. I felt like those characters in the movie when they first see the dinosaurs. The first big waterfall I saw, I was like, oh my gosh. It was just, it took my breath away. It really is a place that I have grown to really love, and I'll visit it anywhere from 2 to 3 times a year throughout different points. In the spring to see it really pumping, in the summer to kind of take a break from the heat in central Washington, and then in the fall as a goodbye before I see it again next spring. But a lot of people, that waterfall by far is the most majestic, but a lot of people don't know that if they hike another 2.5 miles from the top of those falls, there's another set of waterfalls. Still spectacular, but not as grand as that 45 footer. I think the one that's 2.5 miles in, it's about 40 feet that plunges in, but you can't really safely get down to the base of it. But there used to be a footbridge that the Forest Service put in that put you right over the top of the falls. So if there wasn't anybody around, you could literally sit on top of the falls and just dangle your feet off the falls. But if you continue going around and follow the creek, you are presented with a hidden waterfall grotto that you could definitely get underneath. And it's just a really cool place. And a lot of people miss it because, they see that 40-footer, and the other one that's kind of like a grotto is tucked in a little bit. You can't see it from the footbridge, but it's just a really cool place. And I haven't made it to the second falls in quite a long time, but it's just a really great place. And, for the first couple years that I went to it, because nobody really felt comfortable crossing the log without any rails, I really had that place to myself, because I don't even think the restroom was opened, or they were checking for passes, because I think without the bridge, they just didn't expect people to use the trailhead and the parking lot. So it was really neat to have that place all to myself for years. It's gotten more popular over the years now that, things are fixed, but you can still find it to yourself quite often, especially on weekdays. So the next question, and it's, one question that I kind of ask guests on the podcast is, in a sense, what's the scariest hike and why? I've shared the experience that I had where, one day I just decided to go on a random hike that I've done before. And I really didn't tell anybody because I was just like, it's only going to be an hour, maybe two, really quick. I get on the trail. No one else is around me within the first half mile. Right before we do the first switchback and we start climbing, I just see a big animal cross the trail. I didn't get a good view of what it was. It was either a black bear or I guess it could have been a cougar. I just didn't get a good look at it. I just knew it was big, and I was all by myself. Didn't have any bear spray. All I had were my trek poles. So instantly, I got scared. And I literally backtracked. I just ended up walking backwards until I got to a place where I felt safe. And then I just ran to the car. So that's one that I've shared. But, with these questions that people have asked, I got a chance to think of some of my previous experiences. And I think the one that really scared me was in Hawaii. There is a small little island on the windward coast of Oahu called Mokolei. Has a nickname, but it's pretty derogatory, so I won't say it. But you can paddle out to it, you can swim to it, and if you time it right, you can actually walk to it if you time the tides right. And we've kind of eyed it for a few weeks, a few months, me and a couple coworkers. And one of my coworkers got a chance to use a few paddle boards. We decided to give it a go. So we paddled out. And it's not that long of a paddle. I think we made it within, 10, 15 minutes, if that. But once you reach the little island, there's a little trail that leads to the very tip of it. It kind of looks like a hat. So we climbed to the top. It was gorgeous, beautiful sunny day. And we kind of got a chance to explore all around the island and see, hidden coves that you couldn't see from shore. And it was a really awesome time. But after spending maybe an hour there, we noticed some unfavorable weather coming our way. So we decided to boogie on down and start paddling back to shore. But the squall it was fast, because by the time we got to the paddle boards and started paddling out, it was on us. The sun was gone. It was raining. It was cloudy. It was windy. At that point, I wasn't a super strong paddler. My other two friends had a little bit more experience than I did, and they were able to get, going pretty quickly. And so did I, but I was still, lagging behind them. I don't know if I got caught in a riptide or, just that section of the ocean, the current just caught me. But I got to a point where I was paddling as strong and as fast as I could. And I wasn't making any progress. Like, my friends were starting to, create quite a bit of distance between me and them. And I kind of started to panic. But before I really panicked, I figured I would yell at my nearest friend and let him know what was happening. So I yelled. He was able to paddle back to me, and I kind of explained what was going on with him, and he kind of understood. There was a little channel that you could kind of use to propel you back to shore, and I just hadn't seen it. To get back to that channel because of how just the weather was going, I had to grab onto his leash from his board, and he paddled. I paddled with my free hand, and he literally had to tow me to that channel because I just wasn't able to make it under my own strength. And then by the time we got, to a decent portion where I could, where I could paddle on my own, I let go of the strap and continued on to shore. But that by far was probably my scariest situation, where there was definitely, I was probably 5 seconds from panicking and being like, oh my gosh, I'm going to get pulled out to sea. But luckily that didn't happen. And it was a good experience still, but definitely it was a one and done. I made it out to the top of that little island, and I was okay with admiring it from the shore after that. Because also, one thing I didn't mention, it's a known hammerhead shark breeding ground around that island. So that was also playing, a role in my panic and anxiety when getting stuck out there. The next question comes from At the Real Park Life. What's the most essential thing that you bring on hikes besides water? And for me, it's two things that I always triple check that I have in my pack. The first one is my life straw, and then my second is my Garmin InReach Mini for emergencies. Now, I haven't had to use either of them. There's definitely been moments in the past where I wish I had them. Not just one life straw, but two, just in case it fails. But those are the two things that I always double check and triple check. So Kelly Ann asked, what would be my dream backpacking trip? For me, there's some places in Canada, especially around Banff National Park, that I would love to do a 2 or 3 day backpacking trip because some of those secluded, tucked away alpine lakes just look amazing. I've been to Lake Louise and Lake Moraine, but some of these smaller lakes that you have to hike to and backpack to are just gorgeous, and you don't have to deal with the crowds that you do at Lake Louise. So I think a summer backpacking trip in the Canadian Rockies, especially around Banff, to explore some of those alpine lakes would be my dream backpacking trip right now. So the next question is from my buddy Austin, who we're working on something for the spring. Hopefully it'll be my first back on the trail podcast episode, weather permitting. But he asked, do I have any deep thoughts during the hike, or is it just chilling and having a good time with friends? And I would say it's a little bit of both. Especially with my solo hikes, it gives me time to reflect and think on things, and it usually provides clarity to challenges that I'm facing, whether it's professionally or personally. But what's interesting is they definitely seem to spark more conversations on the trails with strangers. So having that moment to kind of reflect and get clarity, I notice that I'm engaging more with strangers on the trail on solo hikes, as opposed to being a part of a group hike. It's definitely fun and engaging with friends, hiking with friends. But I do notice that the interactions with strangers become more of a one-on-one conversation with, one person from your group with a stranger, or one person from each group talking. You don't really see groups engaging with other groups on the trails, or at least I haven't. So for me, it's a little bit of both. Definitely provides some time to reflect and think about things, and then other times it's a good time with friends and just joking around, having a good time. The next question comes from Hiking with Monica on Instagram. What makes you passionate about hiking? I would say the first half of my hiking timeline, hiking was one of those things that taught me to really enjoy and appreciate the journey to each destination, regardless if it's a new hike or one that I've done multiple times. I use Union Creek Falls as an example. I must have done that hike at least 20 times in my life, and each time it's still very much an awe-inspiring experience. Just like if it was the first time I've seen it. Lately, though, I would say the hiking community, both online and on the trails, have really fueled my passion for hiking. Everyone I've interacted with in the last year have been amazing and supportive. It's not to say that there aren't any rude individuals out on the trail or on social media, but they're very few and far between. Something that I've really noticed is how helpful and supportive everyone is. And just recently, there was a place in Utah that captured my attention that wasn't geotagged. It wasn't really found anywhere online. Somebody that I follow posted a picture of it, and through some research I was able to find exactly where it was, and it's not listed on Google Maps. But just the other day, somebody that I think in the coming weeks we'll be able to record an episode with them posted a very similar picture asking if anybody knew where that exact location was. My interactions with him, I knew he would be a good steward, so I was like, oh, I got you. I researched this place a week or two ago. I wasn't 100% sure just because from the satellite satellite images looks different from the Instagram pictures. But after I sent him the coordinates, he verified it. It's something that I'm looking forward to visiting in the springtime. Just that collaboration with the community, I was able to help him out. Hopefully he'll get a chance to hike and visit those sites. And so for me, the passion comes from just the community and the support that everyone kind of gives one another. It's really something that's great to be a part of. Fables and Fells on Instagram asked what was my most memorable hiking experience. And I would say it would be a trip. Hiking around Banff, Canada, especially Peyto Lake, was probably my most memorable hiking experience. And that was probably like 10 years ago, if not, about 10 years ago. I ended up coming across Peyto Lake on Tumblr, I believe. The picture I saw just didn't look real. It looked like somebody had edited the watercolor to make it look like blue Gatorade, because it's a lake up in the Canadian Rockies. So there's these jagged mountains surrounding it and forest, and just the watercolor just looked out of place. Through researching, I was able to, find that it was Peyto Lake and it was in Banff National Park. And then that's what led me into learning about Lake Louise. So I was able to convince a couple of my friends to do a road trip up to Banff late in the summer. And we made the mistake of having our first night be at one of the local campgrounds right next to Lake Louise. And we decided to set up a tent and camp at least the first night there before we went to our Airbnb for the rest of the trip. We didn't think anything of it because when we arrived and the week that we were going to be there, the temperatures were going to be in the 70s, the upper 70s, and we thought we'd be fine. But we were wrong. First, we couldn't really get a fire going, and when we finally did, it was hard to keep going. Typically, it would only last about 10 to 15 minutes, and that was because all the firewood that was available at the campground was soaked from all the rain prior to our arrival. And, we were able to somewhat cook hot dogs and have a meal, and it wasn't bad. We were able to stargaze a little bit, and we called it a night around maybe 10, 11 at night. But then come 3 o'clock in the morning, I wake up shivering along with my friends who are also awake and are shivering. And we all at the same time notice that there is ice inside of our tent at the top because of our condensation that we were generating. It was freezing cold. I think by the next day, we looked it up, and it was somewhere in the mid-20s that night in and around Lake Louise, which we weren't really prepared for. We did have, sleeping bags that were rated for like 32-degree weather, but nothing in the 20s. Luckily, we had some emergency blankets, so we put the emergency blankets underneath all three of us, and then another emergency blanket on top of us. And then we huddled close together, as close as we could to try to stay warm. And if anybody has seen the movie Without a Paddle, it was very much that scene where we all three had a huddle and just try to ride out the cold. And I think we were able to generate enough heat where we fell back asleep. By far, that's the coldest I've ever been in my life. So that was the first night. The next day, we go see Lake Louise and Lake Moraine, and they're spectacular. I mean, the pictures don't do them justice, but they are really amazing. On our last full day in Banff, we finally made the drive out to Peyto Lake because it's almost on the way out of Banff. It's one of the first places I've ever seen online that even online I was blown away of what it looked like. But when I got there and I actually saw it in person, it took me a couple minutes to comprehend what I was seeing, like literally speechless, and just trying to really focus and make sure that I'm seeing this lake that's the color of blue Gatorade, surrounded by green forest and a giant mountain. We ended up hitting all the viewpoints there at that lake. And on the third viewpoint, we noticed that there was a trail leading down into the forest, but nobody was coming and going from it. So we kind of talked amongst ourselves, and we decided we would go about a mile or two down, see if it led to the lake. And if it didn't, then we would just turn back up and hike out. And luckily it did lead down to the lake. It was amazing because we had the lake all to ourselves. There wasn't any other individual down on the shore. We got a really clear shot straight forward of the glacier that fed the lake. And then we had to hop around the creek that was flowing from the glacier into the lake. It was just an amazing time walking the shores, kind of being like kids again, looking at the different rocks and soil that was there because it looked different. It was different from anything we had seen in Washington. What started off as just dipping our toes in to see how cold the water was ended with us swimming around in the coldest water we've ever been in. When we visited Lake Louise, my buddies jumped into it. They became a tourist attraction because nobody else was in the water, but they were. And they both said that Lake Peyto was by far colder than Lake Louise. But it was still a good time. And, having to hike back out and to the car definitely made us break a sweat and get the heat back into our legs and arms. So that was a truly amazing trip. It was the perfect ending at our time in Banff. It was just a really great trip, a really great experience, and a place that I hope to visit either this year or next year and just see it again. At the Real Jelly had asked, is there a bad experience you had while hiking that you learned a lesson from? This one is probably another one from Oahu. So I was able to do Stairway to Heaven, which is a popular trail there. And unfortunately, I think it's going to be, or at least the stairs are going to be taken away. It was always one that me and my friends were only going to do if the weather conditions were perfect for it. Just because it's known to be dangerous, especially during wet conditions. So at my job there on Oahu, each summer we would get a few French interns from an engineering school in Nice, France. And leading up to their final weeks with us, they asked me and a coworker if we'd be willing to take them up to Stairway to Heaven via the backside trail and not the actual stairs before they left. We agreed to it. The weather wasn't great each weekend that we were kind of eyeing. And because they had become really good friends of ours and they were amazing interns, we took them up on a day that I wouldn't have gone up normally. But because it was their last weekend with us, it was going to be the last time to try it. And there was potentially a break in the weather where it wasn't going to be raining, maybe like a 4-hour break where we could make it to the top. So we decided to give it a shot and make the climb. And the first sign that maybe this wasn't a good idea was coming across a giant sinkhole in the middle of this road that leads you to the trailhead. Now you can't drive on it. You have to hike on it. It's only for, I think it's BLM or DNR to access that road. But there was a giant sinkhole that the previous times that I did wasn't there. So that was the first sign that maybe this wasn't a good idea. But luckily there's a way around the sinkhole, so we continued on. We hit the trailhead, and the trail leading up to Stairway to Heaven on the backside, it basically follows the spine of this ridge until you reach the top. Some sections are extremely narrow and extremely vertical to where people have set up ropes to help you climb up those sections. Things didn't really get bad until we hit the cloud line, and then it started misting once we were in the clouds. And this made the ropes and the trail extremely muddy and slippery. And one of the last sections before you reach the top, it's a giant rope climb. It's probably 100 feet. At least at that point in time, it was about a 100-foot rope. By the time we reached it, my shoes were caked in mud. The rope was also caked in mud because I was the last one to go. And halfway up the rope, I was just struggling to get any traction because I think at that time I was just wearing trail runners. I literally paused and was like, this isn't worth it. I'm going to call it quits. I'm going to yell at them and tell them to go on, and I'm just going to go below the cloud line and wait for them there. But I figured I'd give it one more shot to see if I can make it up. And sure enough, I slowly was able to gain a little bit of traction and make it the rest of the way, but only to be greeted by some howling winds and nothing but cloud cover at the top. You might be able to see 20, 25 feet in front of you, and then the rest of it's just you're in the clouds. And at the top, there's an old building that used to be a radio tower. So we kind of hunkered down inside there and refueled. Probably didn't spend more than 20 minutes at the top just because it was just miserable with the wind, with the rain and misting, and there just wasn't a view. So after, no more than 20 minutes, we make our way down, and unfortunately it doesn't end there. Around 2 miles from the trailhead, one of the interns rolls his ankle pretty good. And there's a good 5-10 minutes where we're thinking like we're going to have to call in a rescue because it instantly swelled. He was able to put weight on it, but, very gingerly and definitely limping. We did have a first aid kit, but it was, just a simple first aid kit. So we were able to give him some ibuprofen. I think he wrapped his ankle. Yeah, those 2 miles just to the trailhead were pretty steep. We just made it really, really slow and helped him out in sections where he needed a little bit of help. And I thought to a point where I thought I was going to have to carry him the last, I think, 2 miles to the car, which was pretty flat, but just because his ankle was not looking good. But we were able to make it to the car. I think he ended up going to urgent care and they gave him a boot and I think some ibuprofen and maybe some pain meds. But coincidentally, the same intern, the first week he was in Hawaii, stepped on a sea urchin on one foot. And now the other foot, he rolls. So he lands, steps on a sea urchin, and then unfortunately has to leave with another foot injury back home. After that experience, all future interns, AmeriCorps members, and friends, I would tell them, I will not take you on certain hikes unless the conditions are just right. To this day, I still look at the weather, and if the weather looks poor, I'm just going to take a rain check and not risk it. Because that experience, was definitely not a pleasant one. I'm glad, we were able to make it out without having to get rescued. But in the end, the view wasn't worth it. I think they would say that it wasn't worth the trouble of making it up there. But yeah, that was definitely one of the biggest learning experiences when it came to hiking that I've learned over the last couple of years that still holds true to this day. At Wanderlust with Tash asked, what made you want to start the podcast? So after moving from Hawaii, I moved to Phoenix, and I was there through the pandemic the first year and a half. And then I moved back to the Pacific Northwest in October of 2021. I still had friends in Washington State, but a lot of them had moved to different areas. Forced me to do solo hikes again, just because my good friend that did live in the area, he worked on weekends, so our schedules didn't sync up on our off days. He would still give me recommendations and stuff, but it really forced me to go out and do solo hikes. And that really helped me meet people on the trail and talk to them, especially other solo hikers. You get a chance to learn a little bit about them, some of their favorite hikes in the area, and even some tips and tricks about the trail that you're on, and even a little bit of history of the area. And I really had some really great conversations with folks when I first got back to the Pacific Northwest. And it really made me think if there was a way I could capture those conversations. I thought people would be interested in hearing other hikers' takes on certain things. So I looked into what I thought was a portable recording setup, and I packed it into my backpack and hit the trails. And the first season was actually out on the trails talking to people. It was more short form because I didn't want to keep people too long from their actual hike. But towards the end of summer, there was a lot more weather difficulties, and at least in my neck of the woods, we literally went from 80-degree days on a weekend, and then 7 days later there was snow on that same area. So we really didn't have a fall here in eastern Washington. And even if you drive around now, you see that there's still leaves on the trees just because they haven't fallen, because it was just a quick freeze. After those difficulties, the weather difficulties, and just knowing that it was going to be harder to record outside, I considered pausing the podcast until the spring, then picking it back up with hikes and recording on the trails. But by then I had a good following of different hikers who were sharing some amazing content on Instagram. So then I started researching like virtual podcast recording, then just started DMing some of my favorite hikers on Instagram and seeing if they'd be interested in recording a podcast episode and sharing their experiences. And so far it's been a blast. I've really enjoyed talking to everyone, and it gives me that opportunity to learn not just about hiking here in the Pacific Northwest, but I got to talk to people in the East Coast, in the Midwest, and even over in the UK. It's just been a really great experience to hear everyone's story and how they got into hiking. And it's just been a really great experience for me, especially kind of getting back into hiking in the Pacific Northwest. And it's definitely helped me want to get into maybe backpacking this year. I'm thinking I'm going to be doing at least a 1 day or 2 day backpacking trip, just because the people that I've talked to on this podcast have made it seem really enjoyable and rewarding. And I think it's definitely something that would pique my interest, and I would kind of dive headfirst into once I do it. All right. So then the last question from the community was from mel.v1989 on Instagram, and they wanted to know what my favorite hip hop group was. This was a tough one because there's been different phases throughout my life. I've really enjoyed hip hop. That was something I grew up with. And then over the last decade or so, it's definitely, I've explored more genres of music. But I think right now my favorite hip hop group is the group Felt, are made up of Murs and then Slug from Atmosphere. I was really happy that they released a new album in 2020 after quite a long time of not releasing any albums. But I just like the production that they do. They sample a lot of old records and make them new. But I would say Felt right now is my favorite hip hop group. And then lastly, what do I have planned for 2023 as far as hiking? The first one, I was definitely motivated and inspired by a lot of the community members, especially at the Wild Compiled. Sarah for signing up for the 52 hike challenge. After researching and seeing, everybody signing up, it's definitely something that I was interested in, and I was able to sign up for it. So this year, I'm hoping to hike 52 hikes within the calendar year and cross that off my list. A couple of other goals: doing my first backpacking trip, getting that under my belt, and getting more comfortable with spending overnight trips out in the wilderness. I think this year I'm going to take up my friend Rachel's offer of doing the enchantments in a single day. I think she's done it 2 or 3 times with a couple friends where they just do a through hike early in the morning and end early evening. So that's something that I'm interested in doing, and I'm hoping that some of the training that I'm doing will help me be able to get those 20 plus miles under my belt. But yeah, I just want to say thank you to everyone for submitting their questions. Thank you for everyone for listening and helping grow this podcast. And yeah, I'm really excited to continue going forward, and we have some really amazing guests lined up for the next couple weeks, so stay tuned for those. Thank you to everyone who submitted their questions on Instagram. Allie Rambles, Allie at Beyond the Sidewalks, Rachel, The Park Life, Kelly, Austin, Hiking with Monica, Chloe at Fables and Fells, Jana Lee at The Real Jelly, Natasha at Wonderlust with Tash, and Mel at Mel.v1989. We also have some amazing guests lined up for the upcoming weeks. Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of the Hikes and Mikes podcast. We'll be putting out new episodes every week through the fall and winter. Be sure to like and subscribe to not miss out on those. Also, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Hikes and Mikes. Catch you on the next one. This episode's music was created by Ketsa. Follow him on Instagram at Ketsa Music. This episode is brought to you by Flip Socks. Whether you're on the trail, on the job, or in the yard, Flip Socks will keep Mother Nature out of your boots with their innovative nylon sleeve. You no longer need to worry about any annoying debris getting trapped in your boots during your hikes. Simply flip down the nylon sleeve over any boot to prevent Mother Nature from finding its way inside, keeping your feet comfortable all day long. To get your first pair, visit flipsockswithaz.com and enter promo code HikesMikes10 at checkout to receive 10% off your order. And for listeners who use the promo code at checkout, I'll be donating 100% of the Season 2 promo code proceeds to Big City Mountaineers, who provide transformative experiences through connections to nature that strengthen life skills and build community for youth and disinvested communities across the nation. So if you're tired of bits and pieces of the trail finding its way into your hiking boots, pick up a pair of flip socks today with the promo code HikesMikes10 to get 10% off. For website and promo code, see the episode description.